Welcome to the Alabama Department of Archives and History. My name is Alex Colvin, and I'm the Public Programs Curator here at the Department of Archives and History. I want to welcome you today to our Food for Thought. Before we begin, though, I have a few quick announcements for upcoming programming. Firstly, I'd like to invite you to our summer genealogy workshops. They begin this Saturday. We're going to have two of them, one this Saturday and one on July 27th. You can sign up online, as you can look to our website for where you can sign up for our genealogy workshops. I'd like to invite you next Tuesday, June 25th, for a History Now on the Scottsboro trial. It's going to be in conjunction with a temporary exhibition that, if you were here in person, you saw as you walked in with the Scottsboro Museum. So we're going to have a History Now on the trial to kind of talk about how the legacy of that trial affects us still today. I'd also like to invite you again next month to Food for Thought on July 18th, as Christy Anderson will present Documenting the Architecture of the Everyday in Alabama. So remember that this programs will continue on throughout the rest of the year. Food for Thought is sponsored by the Friends of the Alabama Archives and the Alabama Humanities Alliance. We would not be able to do our programming without both institutions, so thank you to them. Please take a second to silence your cell phones as we are about to begin our presentation. And I am honored to introduce you to Dr. Christina Snyder. Dr. Snyder is the McCabe Greer Professor of History at the Pennsylvania State University. Snyder is the author of Great Crossings, Indians, Settlers, and Slaves in the Age of Jackson, and Slavery in Indian Country, The Changing Face of Captivity in Early America. These books received a wide range of accolades, including the Francis Parkman Prize, the John H. Dunning Prize, the James H. Broussard Prize, and the John C. Ewers Prize. With support from the Guggenheim Fellowship, Snyder is working on her third book, American Abolitions, The Slow Death and Many Afterlives of Slavery. So please join me today in welcoming Dr. Christina Snyder.
Hear me okay? Yes. Is the microphone working? Sounds like it. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming out. It's great to see everyone today. I will be talking a little bit about this book project, my new book project, so I'm looking forward to getting your comments and questions at the end. In 1520, a native teenager was abducted from a coastal region called Chicora of what is now South Carolina. The teen, later baptized as Francisco de Chicora, had been lured or forced onto a Spanish galleon alongside 140 other native people. The ship's captain, an experienced slave trader, had already abducted at least 900 indigenous people from the nearby Bahamas. In fact, slavers had so devastated the native population of the Bahamas that they ventured farther north into the North American mainland. When the Spanish slave ship landed in Winyah Bay, South Carolina, the native people of the region initially fled, but the invaders feigned peace and offered them gifts, luring Francisco and dozens of others on board. The first well-documented slaving expedition in what's now the United States, Gordillo's voyage marks a key moment in the often overlooked history of indigenous enslavement, which ultimately ensnared 3 to 5 million native people of the Americas. After a horrific voyage down the Atlantic coast and into the Caribbean, Francisco de Chicora deported in Hispaniola, where he was enslaved by Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón. A judge and member of the Royal Council of Hispaniola, Ayllón owned plantations and mines where he forced hundreds of indigenous slaves to toil. But he wanted more. In 1528, Ayllón sailed to Carolina, determined to start the first colony on the mainland of North America. The vessels held 600 people, including Spanish colonists, missionaries, and enslaved people from Africa and the Americas. Among the passengers was Francisco de Chicora, Ayllón's most trusted translator. Francisco had worked hard to earn his master's esteem, telling Ayllón exactly what he wanted to hear, that his homeland was rich and that he, Francisco, would help Ayllón take it. Ayllón, like many enslavers, believed that his captives loved him, and he trusted Francisco. But instead of participating in Ayllón's conquest, Francisco and the other enslaved Indians ran away. Manipulating Ione, Francisco had emancipated himself and returned. His homeland had changed, however. Gordillo's raid 6 years earlier had devastated Francisco's homeland and may also have introduced new diseases. Meanwhile, Ione persisted, leaning on enslaved Africans to build the new colony after the native people fled. But unable to navigate inland without indigenous slaves and discouraged by the sandy soil, Ione sailed south and founded the colony of San Miguel de Guadalupe, probably in Georgia's Sapelo Sound. Shortly thereafter, they ran out of food and disease broke out. Many colonists, including Ione, died. A mutiny ensued. After seizing power, an officer named Henez Doncel demanded food from local Wali Indians. The Walis, who had heretofore tolerated the newcomers, attacked the Spanish colony. Enslaved Africans also rebelled, setting fire to Doncel's house. Defeated, the 150 Spanish survivors sailed back to Hispaniola. The first Spanish colony, or the first European colony in what is now the United States, failed, toppled in large part by Indigenous and African resistance. So I want to begin with this idea that the site of mainland North America's first colonies, the American South, is also where the anti-slavery struggle was born. This story is a part of my current book project, which I'm calling American Abolitions: The Slow Death and Many Afterlives of Slavery. It examines efforts to abolish or prohibit slavery in North America from the 1500s to the 1800s. American Abolitions demonstrates that colonialism over the course of centuries brought different forms and practices of slavery into contact with one another throughout the continent. But slavery was inherently unstable, in part because it was contested by enslaved people, by dissenting voices from within slaving societies, or by rival powers, including native nations. The early part of the book focuses on attempts to abolish or prohibit slavery in the colonial South, and that's the focus of my talk today. And mostly what we're going to be looking at is the geographic area that you see on the map here, which is from South Carolina down to northern Florida. My book is comparative, so what I'd like to do for the rest of the time today is to briefly outline 3 important attempts to abolish or prohibit slavery in the colonial South, then think about those examples collectively and draw some conclusions. So one of the important interventions of this book is that the fight against slavery is as old as chattel slavery in the Americas itself. From the earliest days of colonization, critics targeted slavery. Responding to religious and humanitarian concerns, Spain banned the enslavement of Indigenous Americans in 1542. This followed years of debate and pressure from the likes of figures like missionary Bartolomé de las Casas and from Pope Paul III. And I should mention here that Francisco de Chicora, the man whose story began my talk today, he actually visited Spain with his enslaver and spoke to missionaries there, to other people. People recorded his testimony. So there were many Indigenous Americans actually living as slaves in Spain. And this is part of why Spanish people came to understand their stories. So in this ban on Indigenous enslavement in 1542, King Charles I forbade enslaving Indigenous people of the Americas or forcibly removing them from their homelands. Now, this edict was fairly effective at ending slavery for the 2,500 enslaved Native Americans in the Iberian Peninsula, but it was less so in the rest of the empire. Even after the ban, areas like the Mapuche territories in Chile were the victims of enslaving, and the Spanish justified this by using the doctrine of just war, which I'll talk about in a little bit. People of the Caribbean were targeted on the false charge that they were cannibals, and also Muslims were officially exempt from this policy. Moreover, this ban on slavery was impossible to enforce in areas of weak imperial control, like the northern part of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. So what's now the Southwest and Florida. Elsewhere, King Philip II sought to placate colonists and maintain revenues. So he began this campaign of creating new forms of unfree labor. So legal forms of unfree labor in the Spanish Empire persisted in the form of debt peonage, encomiendas, repartimientos, and the mita, which was a mining labor draft. One historian, Andres Resendez, has referred to these forms collectively as, quote, the other slavery. So, despite the kind of half measures taken by Spain, the Lords Proprietors who ruled early Carolina banned Indigenous enslavement there as well. So the colony of Carolina is founded in 1670, and the Lords Proprietors were the 8 Englishmen to whom King Charles II gave joint ownership of the land. The king himself retained full sovereignty over Carolina, but he granted the Lords Proprietors extensive powers, mainly to establish civil structures, to collect taxes and duties, to maintain order, and to have certain trade rights and mineral ownership. The fundamental constitutions, which were Carolina's first governing document, was the work of Lord Ashley, who was one of the Lords Proprietors, and his secretary, John Locke. And yes, it is the famous philosopher John Locke, who used lots of Enlightenment ideas about freedom in chartering that first governing document. So some of the ideas in the fundamental constitution include the idea that the Lords Proprietors had the exclusive right to negotiate with Indigenous nations for land, and also a trade monopoly on trade with Native nations. The idea of religious freedom was supposed to extend to Native people, and the colony was supposed to prosecute crimes by whites against Indians. The ban on slavery comes with this article, quote, "No Indian upon any pretense or occasion whatsoever is to be made a slave, or without his own consent be carried out of Carolina." Now, from the first, this governing document sought to distinguish between Black and Indigenous enslaved people. So even though the document kind of set aside an abolition or prohibition on the enslavement of Native people, it did not do the same for people of African descent. So, for example, the fundamental constitutions made it clear that even if a person of African descent converted to Christianity, that would not free them. So why did they single out Native Americans? There are several reasons that the Lords Proprietors laid out. It was expensive to send soldiers to fight in wars, and they imagined that if colonists were enslaving local Indigenous populations, that would cause discontent, not surprisingly. And we have to remember when we think about this imperial context that whites who are living in these territories are in the extreme minority. So they're surrounded by a much larger Indigenous majority and increasingly by people of African descent. They also cite as a reason the fact that enslaving Native people was at odds with their goal of creating trade with Native nations. So in those days, trade with Native people, especially for things like animal pelts, was big business. The Lords Proprietors had a trade monopoly, and generally speaking, even in our world today, we trade with our allies, not our enemies. So you have to have some kind of relationship maintained for that trade monopoly to work. The Lords Proprietors also expected Native people to help protect their settlement from other imperial powers, and to capture Black enslaved people who ran away. At this time, there is a desertion of people of African descent to the Spanish, which I'll talk about in a minute. And they're also afraid of losing Native allies to the Spanish. So there are all kinds of reasons why the Lords Proprietors see this ban on Indigenous enslavement as being beneficial to the colony, and perhaps most especially beneficial for the Lords Proprietors. The important thing to note as we kind of go through these stories is that it's one thing to create a law in Europe, and it's another thing to enforce it an ocean away. So colonists really ignored this prohibition on Indigenous enslavement from the beginning, and that included people at the highest rank, the colony's governors and council members. From the very beginning, they wanted enslaved people as both laborers to start the plantations that they wanted to produce commodities in the Carolinas, and as saleable commodities. So there was a desire to export enslaved people to other colonies. Most of the people who came to early Carolina came from Barbados. Most of the white settlers came from Barbados, where Indigenous Americans and Africans alike were enslaved. And interestingly, this was part of this broader Atlantic network. Many of the enslaved Native people actually came from New England and had been deported as war captives during the Pequot War and other wars between colonists and Native groups in New England. Importantly, there was no kind of presumption of Carolina being a utopian experiment or a religious experiment. People came to South Carolina to make money. And because it was a proprietary colony and not a royal colony, there's no great benefit to being a good servant to the empire. That is to say, if somebody was a good governor or a commissioner, you can't rise through the ranks to gain a more favorable administrative position somewhere else. There were also very few consequences for trading in Indigenous slaves. The worst consequences that someone could really face would be being removed from one's position. But because support for Indigenous enslavement was nearly universal in Carolina, the Lords Proprietors had difficulty finding any administrator who would enforce the laws. So early on, colonists leaned on the theory of just war to justify enslavement. This was an older idea that came from Europe, and basically Europeans at the time, dating back really to the era of the reconquest of Spain, justified slavery for people who had been convicted of certain crimes, and for war captives taken in what were called just wars. So in 1675, Carolinians wrote to the Lords Proprietors and said that some of their native allies, the Sioux, had offered to sell their war captives to the Carolinians. And this is what the Carolina settlers wrote. These war captives are, quote, enemies to the said Indians who are in amity with the English. And so this is kind of the idea that the enemy of my friend is my enemy. Even more audaciously, Carolina's Grand Council proclaimed that, quote, the said Indian prisoners are willing to work in this country or to be transported from hence. So at least early on in the early years of the colony, there's some rhetoric, at least, of conforming to the laws that the Lords Proprietors had laid out. But even this kind of bare minimal compliance with the laws evaporates over time. So in 1679, there's a war with a local native group called the Westos. And the Westos had been middlemen in the slave trade. They had been major suppliers and allies, actually, of the colony of South Carolina. But the Carolinians feared that this native group had grown too powerful, and so they waged this offensive war against the Westos. When the Lords Proprietors found out about this, they ordered colonial leaders to make peace with the Westos. This really had no effect. And this, again, is the Lords Proprietors' rationale for peace and more broadly for stopping this trade in Indigenous slaves. Quote, by furnishing a bold and warlike people with arms and ammunition and other things useful to them, which they could not fetch from Virginia, New England, New York, or Canada, we tied them to so strict a dependence upon us that we kept all the other Indians in awe. and by protecting our neighbors from their injuries would make them think that our being seated near us is a benefit to them, and that by them we should so terrify these Indians with whom the Spaniards have power. So, in other words, this idea of the value of Indigenous allies and the kind of protection that they could offer the colony. Well, the colonists did not heed this warning. And in the years thereafter, the Lords Proprietors seem to have accepted the fact that they could not prohibit the enslavement of American Indians. So they tried to restrict the practice in certain ways. First, they restricted the enslavement of Native people who lived within 200 miles of the colony. That didn't work, so they later changed this to 400 miles of the colony. They prohibited the colonists of Carolina from trading directly with Native people. They prohibited the deportation of enslaved Native people from Carolina, period. The various colonial governors had varying attitudes toward these regulations, but colonists mostly ignored them. And by 1707, the Lords Proprietors mostly withdrew from colonial affairs, only participating to the extent that they appointed governors. But Native nations devastated by the slave trade took action in a war called the Yamasee War. This happened between 1715 and 1717. And the Yamasees used to reside within Spanish Florida's mission system. But in 1687, they rebelled and moved to South Carolina. They offered various reasons for why they wanted to become allies of the English. One was that the Spanish refused to trade arms with them, which they felt were necessary to protect themselves in this time of heightened warfare. So they actually became allies of South Carolinians and participated in the trade in captives and also in pelts and other commodities. Problems arose within about a decade. And there are different kinds of sources that you can look at to see the kinds of problems that arose in the slave trade. And one of these is the Journal of the House of Commons Assembly in South Carolina, which still exists pretty much in its entirety. And this is obviously a biased document. You know, this is a local governing body of white South Carolinians who held sufficient property and they were elected by their peers. So these were people who were enslavers themselves, who participated in various kinds of anti-Native activities, you know, some of these campaigns. But even in this document, which is admittedly very biased, there are many, many recordings of abuses of what they called the Indian trade. So here's one kind of entry that I'll talk about in a minute, but the kinds of abuses that are recorded in these thousands of pages include things like, quote, "It was a general thing among the Indian traders to meet the Indians a great way off of their towns when they come home for war. The traders would give Native men alcohol and then get their pelts or war captives for nothing or very little. This practice got people like the Yamasees deeply into debt to the traders, so that by 1711, the Yamasees were 100,000 deerskins in debt, which is twice South Carolina's annual export average. So they were so deeply in debt, there's no way that they were ever going to get on the other side of it with regard to these traders. This particular entry is from 1706, and it recounts the various ways that one white trader named John Musgrove enslaved free people. So this was a case of not trading in war captives from Native people, but rather from kidnapping Native people from a tribe or demanding, in this case, that Native people hand over some of their own citizens, supposedly because they had stolen cattle from this specific trader. So This trader, John Musgrove, was accused of enslaving at least 18 free Native people. So again, these kinds of documents, they're biased, but they still give us some kind of a glimpse into the kind of trade abuses. And this one, actually, you can see here, says that some of the caciques themselves, meaning chiefs, had given this testimony. So the Yamasees, once South Carolina's greatest trade ally, lead this multinational effort against South Carolina called the Yamasee War. This starts on April 14th in 1715. They had a meeting with South Carolina's Indian agent. This is the person who's supposed to be the intermediary between the Native nations and South Carolina. The man's name is Thomas Nairn, and he had actually accompanied Yamasees on many occasions and was quite familiar with them. So on this night of April 14th, Nairn and the other English officials met with Yamasee chiefs. They feasted, drank rum, they discussed the troubles in the trade, and the Englishmen probably went to bed believing that they had mended relations with the Yamasees, but they woke up to a very different reality. That morning, which was Good Friday, Yamasees dragged Nairn to their central square, where they bound the traitor to a post and executed him. And this was part of a broader coordinated effort. The Yamasees were in league with other nations, the Muskogee Creeks, the Savannahs, the Appalachians. All of these nations killed almost all of the resident traders living among them. So about 90 of these traders were killed in the first week of the war. So these are the immediate representatives of British trade living within their towns. They also burned dozens of plantations, drove white and black Carolinians into Charleston. So really the only part of Charleston that survives unscathed is fortified Charlestown. In all, Yamasee Indians and the other allied nations killed 400 white colonists, which is about 7% of the total white population. And at this point, South Carolinians really fear complete destruction of their colony. South Carolinians cobbled an army drawn from their own militia, from also enslaved African Americans, from allied Indian nations, and volunteers from Virginia and North Carolina. And together, this diverse force pursued a campaign against the war's instigators. They enslaved most Yamasee survivors, and those who escaped went back to Spanish protection at St. Augustine. The war effectively concluded in 1717, when South Carolina made peace with the remaining Native nations and gained an important ally in the Cherokees. In the aftermath of the war, trade between British and Native nations really focused on deer skins. So this is the time when Native nations really turn away from any kind of human trafficking with the British. Missionary Gideon Johnston said at the end of the war, all we can do is lament in secret those sins which have brought this judgment upon us. And he was very clear about blaming the war on trader abuses. So in the book, I argued that the Yamasee War was Indigenous anti-slavery movement that reshaped colonial law and practice. What it did in the Deep South in particular was to turn Southern colonies away from enslaving Native Americans. And, partially that was because they had come to the Lords Proprietors' point of view that it was too much of a threat to their security, that they were greatly outnumbered and this could destroy their colonies. But I think even more importantly, Native nations refused to participate in it. Another outcome of the Yamasee War is that the British started to argue for a colony south of Carolina. And one promotional tract, let me get back to this. So one promotional tract for this idea that was developed after the Yamasee War said that the land south of Carolina was, quote, the most amiable country of the universe. So you ever been to Georgia? You know that that's true, right? So this leads me to the development of Georgia, and there are really two reasons why, or two ideas that come up in the aftermath of the Yamasee War that lead to the development of Georgia. One is this fear of Native nations, and especially of multinational Native uprisings. And another is that Florida is a haven for free people of African descent. So there is a Black militia there as early as 1683. And there is a broader movement of enslaved people of African descent self-emancipating and running to Florida. So there is this idea in this era of running south to freedom. And I can talk about that a bit more in the Q&A, but what I want to say now in terms of the important facts of this are that we know that at least as early as 1686, that the Spanish sent a raiding party of some Black soldiers and also some Native soldiers to South Carolina. And I think as scholars, it's safe to speculate that enslaved people in South Carolina saw Black soldiers working for the Spanish Empire, understanding that there are certain freedoms that are extended there that are not available in British colonies. And the next year, so the year after this raiding party goes to South Carolina, we see the first documented runaway slaves from South Carolina show up in St. Augustine. So, you know, it's not that far away. And the promise of freedom is pulling people in that direction. And this is a case of where we can see people on the ground moving imperial ideas, imperial law. In November of 1693, Charles II, who's the Spanish emperor, gives an edict granting freedom to runaway slaves who go from British colonies to Spanish colonies. So it's not a broader kind of abolition decree, but it's supposed to be a draw to seize power away from the British Empire and encourage enslaved people to come to the Spanish Empire for freedom. And part of what Spain expected people of African descent to do was to help defend the colony. So by the mid-1630s, the Spanish free people of African descent had established Fort Musa, which is 2 miles north of St. Augustine. There are typically about 100 soldiers stationed there. And so legally speaking, it's the first sanctioned settlement for free people of African descent in what's now the United States. So this fear of Indigenous and Black neighbors, and especially the question of slavery, led to the founding of Georgia. King George signed a charter establishing the colony. Oh, I should actually, one more thing that I'll mention is that it's clear that some of the enslaved people who emancipated and came to Florida were Congolese, and they were already Catholic. And so the Catholic faith is also something that drove this desire to, you know, identify more with the Spanish Empire. And here's an example of the kind of material culture of that. This is St. Christopher medal that was recovered by archaeologists from Fort Mose. So back to Georgia. So this fear of Indigenous and Black neighbors, and especially the question of slavery, is really at the heart of why Georgia was founded. So King George signed a charter establishing the colony in 1732, which is ruled by a board of trustees. These trustees are, you know, a group of men who are wealthy, who are humanitarians. They weren't supposed to own land in Georgia. They weren't supposed to make investments. So from the beginning, it's a bit of a different experiment than South Carolina. It's supposed to be a humanitarian project. And this seal of the trustees of Georgia, you can see it has a silkworm, and I'll get to that in a minute, but this Latin phrase translates to not for self, but for others. James Edward Oglethorpe was really the most famous trustee. He lived in Georgia for a little over the first decade of its existence. So another difference between Georgia and South Carolina is that these, the people who are actually in a governing position are on the ground in Georgia, so have more of an influence than they ever did in South Carolina. And so Oglethorpe is really the major figure that represents the trustees for the first decade plus of Georgia's existence. He was already famous in Britain for conducting a parliamentary investigation into the condition of London prisons. And in general, he favored abolishing imprisonment for debt. So Georgia's original charter lays out a few different justifications for its development. The first is, quote, that Georgia has fertile land sufficient to subsist all the useless poor of England and distressed Protestants in Europe. So this is supposed to be a colony. This is kind of like Australia before Australia. It was supposed to be a colony for debtors, for people who had been convicted of more minor crimes like cheating, begging, or robbing. In line with the thought of the time, the trustees thought that these kinds of crimes were caused by idleness, so people being lazy, and also by necessity. And from the beginning, the trustees believed that slavery was antithetical to the colony's charter because they said while slavery brought great wealth, they lamented the social and moral costs of slavery, especially the, quote, idleness and luxury that it created in white society. Another reason for the founding of Georgia has to do with this kind of geopolitical concerns that I was talking about, which is military reasons. Georgia was supposed to have a series of fortified townships. So the trustees expressed this as, quote, the great danger of the southern frontiers of South Carolina, which are exposed by reason of the small number of white inhabitants. So this is supposed to, quote, render the southern frontier of the British colonies on the continent of America safe from Indian and other enemies. So it's supposed to be this kind of buffer colony between South Carolina and Florida, and also a kind of rallying point for Native allies. The reason that there's a silkworm on the seal of the trustees is that they had this idea that Georgia could produce profitable commodities that did not require enslaved labor. Georgia, quote, being about the same latitude as China, Persia, Palestine, and the Madeiras, should be able to make raw silk, wine, oil, dyes, drugs, and many other materials for manufacture. So there's this idea that white people can be redeemed by hard work, and that Georgia will be a place where the extremes of wealth that one sees in South Carolina or even in Britain don't exist. It's supposed to be this more utopian experiment. And I should say that this charter is written in 1732, and it doesn't outright ban slavery. And it's but the colonists from the beginning, certain colonists are constantly leading this charge that Georgia needed to adopt slavery in order to become profitable. And Oglethorpe refuses to entertain this argument. And he says it's the colonists' lack of industry that led him to push other trustees to ban Black slavery outright. So this legislation is drafted really the year after the settlers arrive in 1734 and is passed in 1735. So, let's see, sorry. So let me talk a little bit about this ban on the enslavement of African descended people. This comes not necessarily from universalist humanitarian concerns, And in their conversations, the trustees rarely expressed concern for African or African descended people themselves. You know, a lot of this is really supposed to be about reform and white uplift. And there's no ambition to abolish or prohibit slavery outside of the Georgia colonies. So from the beginning, it is limited in scope. But the interesting thing is that it's very much pushing against a pro-slavery movement within Georgia itself. So from the beginning, there's a kind of tension between the Lords Proprietors, the trustees and colonists. The first official complaint against this anti-slavery policy is from a South Carolina lumber merchant named Samuel Evely, who wants to send enslaved people into Georgia to harvest timber. He said that Georgia could never make money without slavery, as, quote, persons that are not used to work, end quote, could not harvest trees. South Carolina merchants continually lobbied for the introduction of slavery. And by the following year, by 1735, a pro-slavery faction among Georgia colonists was led by wealthy men who had paid their own way to Georgia. So not necessarily those deserving poor contingent of the Georgia settlers, but people who are already men of means and had brought white servants with them. On the other side of this debate are Oglethorpe, the trustees, and there are many other settlers who remain anti-slavery in this period. So some of the most notable settlers who are in this anti-slavery camp are the Salzburgers. These are Protestants who had been expelled from their Catholic principality in the independent country of Salzburg. That's in what's now Austria. They initially settled at Ebenezer. And another party which remain anti-slavery are the Highland Scots who settle at Darien. In a letter to Parliament in 1738, the Highland Scots wrote, "It's shocking to human nature that any race of mankind in their prosperity should be sentenced to perpetual slavery, nor in justice can we think otherwise of it than they are thrown among us to be our scourge one day or another for our sins. And as freedom to them must be as dear to us, what a scene of horror it must bring about. And the longer it is unexecuted, the bloody scene must be the greater." So the Scots have this, the Scots, it should be noted, are many of the men who make up those fortified military outposts. And part of their concern is this idea of uprisings, but they also are exhibiting some kind of universalist concerns here. The absentee trustees, the ones who are not necessarily on the ground in Georgia, they tend to trust Oglethorpe, who continues to defend this anti-slavery policy. And when they learn of the Stono Rebellion, which is the largest uprising by enslaved people in colonial North America, it happens in South Carolina, in Stono Parish, in Stono near St. Paul's Parish. The trustees believe that it confirms this idea of the danger of slavery and the wisdom of preserving Georgia as a buffer colony. This is, I think it's good to dwell on this for a moment because Georgia at this time is the only colony in which slavery is illegal, the only British colony in which slavery is illegal. It's legal everywhere else, including in New England. And so settlers who disagreed with the prohibition on slavery were the only American colonists who were called on by their critics to make a case for slavery. So people are in this position of either having to defend or their position, whether it's pro-slavery or anti-slavery. So in the 1740s, the pro-slavery group developed various arguments to combat their adversaries. And they gained the most traction from one that blended biological and environmental racism. So basically what they argued was that due to Georgia's hot and humid climate, it was, quote, impossible that white men would be able to work here and live. So in other words, they're saying that, because of intensive plantation agriculture, it was impossible for whites to work outside, which of course is insane. But part of the reason why they're making this argument and why they believe that it will have traction is that, again, they're talking to Parliament an ocean away, right? And, these parliamentarians, most of them have never been to the Americas, have never been to the tropics, don't really know what it's like. And this is an argument, and this is a really, it is ridiculous, which is kind of your reaction to it, right? But it's an argument that has a lot of traction that you would see white Southerners use again and again and again as they fought to defend slavery over time. But even in the 1740s, some white Georgia settlers critique this argument. So the Salzburgers, who I mentioned earlier, pointed out that through hard work and sensible work hours, they produced a lot of rice, more rice than they could consume. So they sold rice to external markets. And they called the pro-slavery party, quote, idle, delicate, and unreasonable. The Salzburgers, among many other British colonists and officials, also worried about the security of the southern border. So as the debate over slavery raged, Spain and Britain were once again at war, this time the War of Jenkins' Ear, which is the greatest of all the colonial war names. Oglethorpe and his native allies won a stunning victory at the Battle of the Bloody Marsh, which seemed to confirm the wisdom of the trustees' objectives and view of Georgia. But following peace with Spain, the military rationale for slavery's prohibition declined. So once the Spanish seemed like less of a threat, that argument had less traction. Over time, support in Parliament weakened, and they declined to extend funds to the trustees. So another thing that made Georgia unique was that this group of trustees every year had to lobby Parliament for additional funding for Georgia. So they had to make their case again and again and again. And they didn't necessarily get lump sums of money. So eventually, their support in Parliament weakened, and they declined funds to the trustees in 1743, which is the same year that Oglethorpe left Georgia. The rallying cry for the pro-slavery party became, quote, liberty and property without restrictions, by which they meant they wanted to legalize slavery. In May of 1749, the trustees caved to Georgia's pro-slavery faction, and two years later, slavery became legal in Georgia. So that's the last case that I'm going to discuss. And now I want to think about some of the key takeaways from looking at all these different efforts to abolish or prohibit slavery. So the first is maybe kind of obvious, but I think it bears talking about, which is abolition is not the same as emancipation. So abolition is often a kind of legal or political process, and it's not the same thing as making people on the ground free. And you can really see the ways in which empires that are stretched very far have weak power in some of these American colonies. The second thing is that these different movements are interrelated. So empires sought to secure what historian Chris Brown has called moral capital by placing themselves at the vanguard of humanitarian movements. In doing so, they justified expanding their dominion. And in the colonial South, you have three powers, Britain, Spain, and France, all jockeying for power. So in the cases that I've talked about today, the Lords Proprietors of Carolina were influenced by earlier Spanish prohibitions on Indigenous enslavement. And later, the southern British colonies and Spanish Florida sought to weaken one another, in part through policies of slavery and anti-slavery. But these same politics were influenced by people on the ground, including people victimized by slavery, by Native nations during the Yamasee War, by self-emancipating Black Carolinians who fled Florida, and who later shaped the Spanish Empire's sanctuary policy. Another thing that I think we see in these cases is the persistence of localism and a rejection of imperial rule, whether those rulers are proprietors, trustees, or the crown itself. This idea of home rule predates the Civil War by centuries. And because of this localism, colonies sought to distinguish between different forms of unfreedom in law and in practice. that were suited to local conditions. They sought to distinguish between Black and Indigenous slavery, between slavery and other forms of bondage like debt bondage, convict labor, and revivals of serfdom like the encomienda. And finally, what we see is that this story of abolition is not a straightforward story of progress. And for that, we can look to Georgia, which demonstrates the precarity and mutability of anti-slavery measures. So that concludes my talk, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
And if you're online, all you need to do is put it in the comments and I can ask it on your behalf. So are there any questions? Oh, yes. Sorry, this one. Yes.
When was the K removed from the Atlantic?
I'm sorry, what?
The K on the Atlantic,
Oh, yeah.
when was that removed?
That's they were very creative with spelling back in the 1700s. There's really no standardized spelling until it kind of depends on the country, but in the United States, there's really no standardized spelling until Webster's dictionary. People just usually spelled things phonetically, and that seemed to be perfectly acceptable. So if you read these old documents, you really have to be creative sometimes with spelling things out.
We have a question online, kind of just to ask about the kind of the different terminology. So white servants, were they enslaved? They're used indentured. Can you kind of expand on what those statuses mean?
Yeah, so one thing that I think comes out in the story is that both empires and colonists wanted to be very particular about the language that they used. And so in the Spanish Empire, one of part of what you can see is that sometimes native enslaved people are later retermed servants, and in reality, there's very little that changes about their condition. However, in the case of Georgia, for example, white servants are coming from England. They are typically indentured. So indentured people had limited terms of service, after which time they would be granted freedom. So there are, really important legal distinctions between servant and slave in the Americas. There is an interesting incident in the 1740s of Irish workers, some of whom were indentured servants, and people of African descent engaged in this riot against the pro-slavery party. So there is like occasionally some collaboration between different groups.
I wanted you to just kind of clarify. Now, of course, we know that the first African-American slaves came to Charleston, 1619, right? Or I guess I'm...
Oh, in
Virginia,
yeah.
To Virginia. So where you're saying in the 1700s where they, I guess, fled to Florida because of the Spanish rules there. So explain how that was possible.
Yeah, great question. I really, it's part of what I'm doing, and this is like covering a lot of ground and timeline. So I appreciate this opportunity to clarify some things. So, 1619 enslaved people from Angola arrive in Virginia. And so that's the first, documented enslaved people from Africa coming to a British colony. But there were enslaved people in Spanish colonies before that. So for example, something that I just want to be clear about is that there are other enslaved people of African descent in Florida, and that what Florida is doing is to offer freedom explicitly to enslaved people from British colonies who want to move there. And so, there's not a kind of universal concern with enslaved people, but this is more of like a very targeted attack on the British, right? And so, there is a, slightly older history of enslavement in Spanish Florida. people of African descent came with the first conquistadors to Florida. And they're meeting, other enslaved people of indigenous descent. So that's part of this first story that I talk about with the Chicora. So fast forward, if we fast forward, really it's almost exactly 100 years. So 1520 is that first voyage that is trying to take indigenous people and sell them as slaves. And then 100 years later, Jamestown is founded. And so what does kind of that geography of freedom look like for people of African descent? Like, what is your goal? I guess I would have to do a little bit more research, but I don't really know that it is conceivable for people to escape from Virginia all the way to Florida, because that is a very considerable distance. But we do have records actually of almost every enslaved person who applied for this sanctuary policy in Spanish Florida. So they actually had to apply and demonstrate that they had come from a British colony. And so they almost all come from North or South Carolina. And so it seems to be something that is pulling people from this more Atlantic coast region into Florida. And in terms of how is it possible, this is a really good question, but we know that some of the people who escaped to Florida were pilots, which means that they had actually worked boats. They were fishermen, or they had worked piloting for merchants. So they actually knew the coastline pretty well. And so, some of them are probably coming by land. It's not actually that far, let's say from the southern part of South Carolina to St. Augustine, but many of them came by boat actually. And so they're using some of that local knowledge of the terrain, or if people had this more fishing or marine experience, they're using that too. And in terms of how do people know, it's really interesting to think about that. But clearly there's an information network where maybe people are seeing these free Black troops coming into South Carolina to defend Spanish Florida. And that makes a certain impression on people. But these Congolese people, they also knew that that Florida was a Catholic colony, right? And that was part of what lured people there. And I guess one more thing I should mention is that these journals of Georgia and South Carolina are full of incidents of Spanish spies who are coming in and trying to lure people to the Spanish side. So it's very interesting.
Thank you.
Sure.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Snyder again.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you again next month on July 18th. Thank you.
Thanks for your questions. Appreciate it, everyone.